Hello, folks, and welcome to this webinar called What's New in TeamCity 2020.2. I'm Marco Behler. I'm the developer advocate for TeamCity at JetBrains. And as the title suggests, we're going through all the new features in the latest TeamCity version. And I'm not just going to show you a couple of slides and go, here's feature 1, 2, 3, 4. Instead, I'm going to do a live demonstration with all the features weaved into a nice little storyline. And even better, we have two very special guests joining later on to show some of the more advanced language-specific integration features of TeamCity, specifically Python and .NET. So you can get excited. Right, let's start off at the very beginning. I'm trying to log into my TeamCity Cloud instance. And I'm just demonstrating everything here with TeamCity Cloud. You could obviously just use the on-premise version as long as you have TeamCity 2020.2 installed. The first change is you can now log in with external services. I have GitHub configured here, so I can simply click Login with GitHub. I'm being redirected to GitHub. Once I sign in here, I'm going to be redirected back to my TeamCity server. It's a simple OAuth 2 login. Right. And when you go to administration, scroll down a bit, go to authentication, you'll find there's a list of authentication modules you can add to your TeamCity server. I just added github.com here, but when you add a new one, you can also select Bitbucket Cloud, for example, GitHub Enterprise, on-premise GitLab Community Edition, Enterprise Edition, or gitlab.com. And the only thing you need to do is, on these applications, for example, Bitbucket Cloud, create a new OAuth 2 application, copy the client secret and client ID back to TeamCity, and you have that login enabled. Really helpful if you want to streamline all your authentication processes. Now that we're logged in, let's show a feature which I think is a very cool feature. It's called agentless build steps. And here I'm actually cheating a bit, so I have not a slide, but I have an image to show you. Think of having a complex build chain in your project. What that could look like is that you compile something, you test something, and then you deploy something. It's just a regular build. And the deployment step doesn't happen on the TeamCity server, but it happens in an external software. So some service, some program, some application, something running for minutes, maybe even hours. And that external software takes some time and then reports back the results to your build agent. The build agent reports it back to the TeamCity server. But during that time that the build is running, the regular build is running, your build agent is blocked. It has to wait till the external software finishes its work. And even though it's idling, it doesn't do anything. And wouldn't it be cool if the build agent were just able to detach itself from the build and be used for other builds? And that's exactly where the agentless build steps come in, because that's now working with TeamCity 2020.2. An agentless build looks somewhat similar. So you have your compilation step, you have a testing step, but then for the deployment step, you detach your build agent from that build, so the build agent can be used for any other build meanwhile. Then the external software can do its thing. And at the very end, once the external software finished processing whatever it did, the deployment, for example, it needs to send back a REST call to the TeamCity server saying, hey, that build has finished successfully. You can either continue with the build chain or it's completely finished. Right. And I actually have such a project on my TeamCity Cloud server. It's called a new to-do list. It doesn't really matter. It's just a simple web application. And I'm going to show you the build chain for it. So here, what I have is I have my build running. Then I have an external deployment approval step, and I have a deployment running on my TeamCity server. Now, the external service I just mentioned, it could be a deployment. It could be any software that's running, as I mentioned, on an external service. It could be a manual QA or deployment approval step. So, for example, you need to send a message to some service where your tests are watching out for new builds, or your boss is waiting for a new build to deploy to production. And it could take an infinite amount of time for that to happen. And during that time, you don't want the build agent to be blocked. That's our deployment approval here, right? And after that, as I just mentioned, the deployment runs. Now, let me just run such a build. It's going to take a second. And meanwhile, while this is running, I'm just going to show you this application I have, the third-party application I have, JetBrains Deploy. It's not something you can download and install yourself. I just quickly created it for this demonstration. So what's going to happen is that our build pipeline, the deployment approval, will send a message to JetBrains Deploy. Here we're going to see the new deployment. We can either approve it or decline it. And once that's done, the JetBrains Deploy application has to send something back to the TeamCity server so that the deployment can actually happen. Let's refresh the page. It still takes a second because the cloud agent needs to boot up for the deployment approval to happen. And while that maybe is happening, it takes some time, I can talk about the licensing already of this feature, because that's something that most people want to know. If you have, say, one build agent license, it means you can run one normal build, and in addition, on top, you can run one agentless build, so 2 in total. If you had, for example, 3 build agent licenses, you could run 3 agent-less builds on top of your 3 normal builds, so 6 in total. And that is really helpful for better build agent utilization. Now let's see. Let's wait for the build agent. The agent is still starting. Even though I took the time to pre-warm the agent, it still took some time. Right, here we go, finally. You can see the build is running. Actually, the deployment approval is running. It will change its icon soon, signifying that it's an external service. It's a detached build. If I go to my JetBrains deployment approval page, I can already see that TeamCity server has sent me a new build, 165. And I can now manually take my time. I can say, hey, I want to approve this build. I can cancel this build anytime I want. The build agent is not blocked on the TeamCity server. So when I go back here, refresh the page, now I can see, well, the icon has changed with a tiny little arrow. That does maybe tell me too much, but even if you go up here, you can see that you have a couple of connected cloud images. You have an agent license currently in use, but you have no running builds. You have one idle agent. It's not doing anything. It could be used for any other build until that deployment approval is finished. Let's do that. Let's approve the build, right? The build is now deploying. JetBrains Deploy now sends back a message to the TeamCity server. And when you go back to the TeamCity server, you can already see the deployment approval has finished. And now the actual deployment is running on the TeamCity server. That's a pretty cool feature. Again, really helpful to get much better build agent utilization. And just to show you what the deployment approval build step looks like internally. So when I go to my deployment approval build configuration, I'm just going to edit that. I can see it consists of 2 build steps. The first one is a command line build step, and this is the step where we need to send a message to my external service, so to JetBrains Deploy in this example. Entirely dependent on what service you're going to call. And the second build step is what does the actual detachment of the build agent. And this happens by printing out a service message, a so-called TeamCity service message, echo # TeamCity build detach from agent to the build system out. So as soon as you print out that message, the build agent will stop working on that build. And now the external service needs to send a REST message to finish the build, if it was successful or if it failed, in any case. That's all you need to do. And what we expect our plugin developers, for example, to do, if you're writing a plugin for an external deployment service, you will probably put in that service message yourself. Otherwise, if you're a power user, if you're writing build scripts, whatnot, then just make sure you put in this one tiny TeamCity service message into the build log, and you can also read up about it in the documentation. That's all you need to do to detach a build agent from a build. Right. That was already the agentless build step feature. There's one tiny, let's say, connected feature in this case. Just going back to the JetBrains deploy application, I mentioned a couple of times this application needs to send back a REST call to the TeamCity server. And to do that, it needs to authenticate. So you have either username or password, or you can use an access token to access the REST services. And for people who have never used access tokens before, you can simply open up the administration, go to users, my user in this example, and here under access tokens, you will see all the access tokens listed that you created. And there's a new tiny feature. What we added is that when you create a new access token, for example, test, you can now give it an auto expiry, for example, in 1 minute. Let's create that. And I can see the token value here. And now all you guys watching have about 60 seconds to do something with that token. After those 60 seconds, the token gets automatically deleted. You can see it here. It got created 17:11. It will expire 17:12, my time zone. And that's really helpful for demos like these, where you don't want to go back and have to delete your token manually. But also for one-off scripts, shell scripts you share with your team members, you can simply put an access token inside, have it auto expire after a certain amount of time, and just not worry about it anymore. Tiny feature, but really helpful in these cases. Now that we talked about some more meaty features, let's have a look at some eye candy that came with our latest version. Some people might have noticed already there's now a dark header. Tiny change, but be aware that while there is not yet a full dark theme, we're also adding in the future releases, there will be some pages in the TeamCity server as a tiny teaser. We'll be getting a dark mode as well. For now, it's just the header here. And if you're writing external plugins, front-end plugins for the TeamCity server, you'll need to make sure to upgrade to our latest UI framework so the plugins display in the header, for example. Just be aware of that. Just having a nice-looking header is obviously not everything. What we also have is we have two UIs. The TeamCity server comes with two UIs. We have the classic UI, and we have the new experimental UI, also called Sakura UI. And these two UIs are not yet up to full feature parity, meaning that in the new UI, which is generally better, newer, more modern, smoother, there's a couple of pages missing that are existing in the old UI. And also here, what we do is with every release, we're just adding more features from the old UI into the new UI, and also making them better along the way. Now let me open up this build here, for example, that just happened. And I think a very cool feature, actually a really top voted feature for a long time, is that now when you look at the build log, you can go and finally search inside the build log. So if I search for Maven here, you will get all the occurrences of Maven highlighted in the build log, and you don't have to scroll up and down again to find your keywords. Really, really helpful. Then there's tiny things depending on what you're used to seeing. But for example, the dependencies tab, here we always make tiny changes. The dependencies tab up until this version only showed the left dependencies of your current build configuration. So if there was something before build, you would only see that, but you didn't see the right everything coming after your build configuration here in this case. So you wouldn't see deployment approval and deployment. And these are tiny changes, but we're also adding them in this case that you see everything at once. What also changed is we added the test history page. So in the new UI, so that only existed in the old UI, you can go have a look at every single test, open up the test histories page, and I'm going to ignore the graphic for a second. I'm going to get into that in a second. But let's have a look at the table down here. you'll essentially see all the test runs. This test ran a couple of times here already. You'll see that it was successful every time. You'll see the duration. You'll see the branch of the change. You'll see the build agent ran. You see when the test ran, so a couple of times already. All of that in that nice table down here. And if you're more of the graphics type, you'll also see this in a graphic, which doesn't make too much sense with 24 runs, but at least you'll see they roughly took the same time every time, so about 4 to 6 seconds, 5 seconds roughly, and you'll see these 24 runs. And if you have more runs and some of them failed and some of them were spiking in the execution time, you'd have a much nicer graphic here. But just be aware of that you now in the new UI, you also have a very nice test history page. And another feature that we have, I'm just going to quickly run a new build, is that we updated our build queue. This is the old build queue you're seeing here, where you essentially saw the change to build configuration, who it was triggered by. And when you have a look at that build queue in the experimental mode, by clicking that icon over here, you'll see that now the builds are ordered by the build pools. I don't have any build pools here, but otherwise you'd see by pool, you'd see all the builds in the queue. And you can actually also see directly jump into everything that concerns a build, into the overview page, into the changes that trigger the build, into the build log, and all of that kind of stuff. So just keep an eye out for all these improvements. If you're still on the classic UI, now is the time to switch to the experimental UI, because as I said, we're adding more and more features every single release and making them better along the way. Now that we had a look at some eye candy, let's have a look at another feature again, which is useful for our Bitbucket Cloud users. And thankfully, my ANU to-do list project lives on Bitbucket Cloud, because we now also support Bitbucket Cloud pull requests. And I'm going to start out actually by going into my Bitbucket Cloud repository, and I'm just going to add a new file. I'm just going to call that hello world, for example. I'm going to commit. And the Bitbucket Cloud UI gives me the option to create a pull request for this change. I'm going to see, yes, it's going to create a pull request with the branch name Marco Behler, hello created online. I'm just going to commit that. And now TeamCity takes up to 60 seconds to detect that pull request and build it. And afterwards, what's going to happen is TeamCity is going to send back a message to Bitbucket Cloud that you'll find here under the build section, saying that the build was run, some tests passed or failed and whatnot. Let me show you how this is configured in TeamCity. So again, I'm going to edit my build configuration for the build. And you go to the build features section. And the build feature section, you can simply add a build feature, a pull request build feature, and point that to your Bitbucket Cloud repository. We had that feature already working for Azure, for Bitbucket Server, GitHub, GitLab, but in the latest version, because of the implementation details of how they implemented pull requests on the Bitbucket Cloud side, it took a while for us to catch up. But now you simply choose Bitbucket Cloud as the type, username, password. You can also filter by pull request by a specific branch to not just build any pull request, but then TeamCity will pick up the pull requests that happen on TeamCity Cloud and trigger a build for each and every one. And there's a second feature, which is not directly connected to just pull requests, but makes a lot of sense. It's the commit status publisher feature. And that is the feature that sends back the build status to Bitbucket Cloud or any other system that you have connected, saying that the build worked or it didn't work. Now let's go to my projects page and see. Actually, this time it was really rather quick. You can see that TeamCity was already smart enough or fast enough to build that Marco Behler hello created online pull request. It worked expectedly. It just finished a couple of seconds ago. So that exactly worked yeah, it worked as expected. And when I go back to Bitbucket Cloud and refresh the page, I should see a nice little message from the commit status publisher, a new to-do list, build 34, finished 1 minute ago, and 2 tests were passed. And if I click that link, I will actually be redirected straight into my TeamCity server. Super useful feature if you're working with Bitbucket Cloud. And just as a tiny side note, if you're an early user of JetBrains Space that launched a couple of weeks ago, Space also supports a repository hosting and also automation. And the commit status publisher that I just showed that sends back the message now also works with JetBrains Space. Right. Now, this about sums up the features that I can tell you all about in the latest TeamCity release. And up next, as I mentioned already at the beginning, I have 2 special guests joining us. For the moment being, I just have 1 special guest joining us who's going to help me building some Python projects, because I'm not the biggest Python project in the world, but he is. So let's say hello to Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Marco. Hey, that was a slick demo, man.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, test history stuff. That's really cool in the new UI.
Yes, I actually, myself, I like the agentless build step feature so much. But yes, the test history, the build queue, also really helpful in your day-to-day work. Yes, but I hope you, as I just mentioned, brought a nice little Python project for us that we can demonstrate, that we can build.
Sure. This is exciting to work on the world of Python and repositories and open source. They have a lot of features that they need from CI and especially internal stuff, and they hit limits. And TeamCity, really feels like when you need features, they're really important to your organization, you're going to need something like TeamCity, and that includes for Python as well. So I've got a repository that I use for my tutorials and stuff. It's about girls across fastest sport on 2 feet. And it's just a sample project, and it's a repository. And I'd like some help from TeamCity on CI for just making sure the tests pass and that the linter runs and stuff like that. Can TeamCity help me?
It can absolutely help you. It can absolutely help you. And I think both of us together will get a nice little build running for your Python project. But just maybe for now, might you want to refresh your page, because I'm getting some weird artifacts, and maybe other viewers are also getting some weird artifacts and watching your screen, actually.
All right. So I think what this may be is an effect. Yeah, I'm looking at that. I will switch to Chrome. My apologies.
No worries.
All right. And
yeah, every good Python project. No, that's not true. That actually, let's see. It looks better.
Does it look better?
It looks better. Let's see what happens once we add our Python project to it.
All right. And just in case, I'll go ahead and log into in Chrome. I'm doing the 2-factor authentication right now.
Yes.
All right. And you and I had set this up previously where I already had an account on here. And so I'm able to, on this TeamCity instance that you're running, go ahead and add a project that's connected to my GitHub.
Yes, you're actually logging into my TeamCity Cloud instance. Is that, can I just ask, is that now the Chrome? Is that now Chrome?
It isn't. But just to make sure, I will move this over, see if this helps. If not, then it's me running TeamCity or running StreamYard in Firefox that's causing the problem. So is it still a problem? It's still a problem.
It is still a problem.
Okay. So unfortunately, what this means is I will need to switch to Chrome. Is there any chance you can go to Matthias?
Yes, we can also go to Matthias if he's ready already.
Right.
So then we're just going to take a quick break from Paul because of these technicalities. Let's talk about .NET for a second, because what we have planned with Paul, showing you the new Python runner, we also have a new .NET runner that didn't come with the latest TeamCity 2020.2 release. It came already one release earlier, but still we hadn't described it properly in a webinar. So now we're going to take the time to do just that. And for that, I need a .NET expert. Thankfully, we have a good friend of mine, Matthias Koch, is presenting how to build .NET projects in a second. So hello, Matthias.
Marco, thanks for having me. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
My laugh, actually. Okay, so you see my screen?
I can see your screen. It doesn't have any artifacts.
For me, it works, yeah.
That looks pretty great.
I had that issue too before. What I did was switching between two tabs all the time to make it refresh. Maybe if it persists for Paul, then maybe that is a workaround.
Right.
Okay. So here I have a very, very simple .NET project. And the only thing it does is really it has like one class library, but doesn't do anything. So I barely have a class here, but no method actually. But for the sake of you already touched the testing part, I also have a test project, which also doesn't do anything, but at least I have some tests. So 10 with an amount of 10. And let's see, one thing I want to briefly mention here before and I think at this time then we can fully switch to the TeamCity UI, is especially for the new projects, for the new project kind, which is the SDK-based and .NET Core typed project files. What is good to have is I'm using XUnit here as a test framework. You could also use NUnit, but what is very important here is first to have this Microsoft.NET SDK test.sdk. Said SDK once too often. But the more interesting fact is here that we're adding a package from TeamCity VS test adapter. And we will see in a moment what that actually does, but it's good to have that package in reference in your test project. And
I'm excited because I mean my Python, my .NET knowledge is not up to par really, but let's see what that now looks like when trying to build a new project.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I pinged you before. I think I have no permissions to add projects anymore. Is that right?
You have no permissions to add projects anymore. Let me see. Did you log in with a new user? Today, there seemed to be, yes, it looks like you logged in with a new user. Very interesting. Let me just change it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I also have it on my own cloud instance from TeamCity. If we can make it work faster that way. It's a good opportunity to also say cloud instances is better, and you can subscribe for that if you like.
Could you try and refresh the page?
Yeah, sure. No, not yet. Doesn't seem like it. Not yet. Should I use my cloud instance?
Then please use your cloud instance. Yeah. There's a couple of things that can go wrong, folks. So we tried this out a couple of times. It always worked. I don't know why it just changed back, but this seems to be the spirit of this webinar.
Okay, so let's see. That's not so bad. The only thing I need is I will briefly delete the old one, which I just used for retesting everything that we prepared. Okay, project home. this is my project home, and now I just create a new project. So let's see.
So again, for me, just a couple, it doesn't really matter what type of project. Obviously, you're creating, you just start out with your VCS repository, paste in the URL, and Matthias is now using .NET, but that's the same with Python, which you're going to see in a bit, hopefully, and all the other projects.
Okay, so first it took a while for TeamCity to grab all the repositories that I have connected to my account. Then I took the TeamCity updates repository, and let's add that. In the first step, we'll just create the project, right? So not very different from all the rest. Now, the first page afterwards is really interesting already, because this is something that I always love, because TeamCity does some auto detection magic and tries to find meaningful steps that I can now select from a list of suggested steps, and I can just use them. And for now, we will go with those two. So this is generally in .NET, also with the first move to .NET Core, and now it's not even called .NET Core anymore, but it's just .NET. So a bit of a naming crisis. I don't know. But we will use those two suggested steps, which first builds and then execute tests.
Right. Is this what you would do, basically, essentially recommend? I mean, you're obviously going to test, always run tests for your project in the build. What comes out of the build in the .NET world? So what does it produce?
Build is more or less the equivalent to compile. It doesn't do anything more than that. Well, there is a step which is kind of included if you're not opt-in to skip it, which is to restore dependencies. So .NET uses a good package for dependencies, and we can actually see that in detail also if we browse the build step. So now I went to edit that first build step for .NET Build, and well, what we start with is usually that. So I've hidden the advanced options for a second, and we can see the runner type is .NET. I will come back to the restore in a moment.
Okay.
But here's interesting. Let's open that up. We have selected .NET now. Now, previously, if you used TeamCity for building in .NET, then you might have used some of the now deprecated runner types, which is the .NET Process Runner, MS Build. So MS Build is still used through the .NET runner type. It's a new way to invoke all that. And
just to interrupt you, that is how far my .NET knowledge goes, basically, that we had a couple of different runners, which are now bundled all into one .NET runner for every single .NET project you'd ever want to build.
Right. Yeah. I want to give a little warning here. It really depends on what projects you're using. So there are certain types of projects, but they get less and less over the time, which can't be built with the .NET runner, and that's a .NET issue. So not really a TeamCity issue, but .NET. So just if you hit some obstacles, then it's good to investigate if that might be the problem. But we also have MS Build as deprecated, Visual Studio Tests, etc. But now we can just use the all-in-one .NET runner.
Right, the one runner to rule them all.
Right.
Yes.
Now, one thing that has been pre-selected here is our build command. So .NET comes with a couple of commands, including top-level commands, which build, like we mentioned already. We can also see restore here. So the list is, of course, ordered alphabetically, but if I would order it more like from their semantics, then restore would then clean and restore might come first. But it would start with clean, restore, then build, pack, publish, etc. All of these. And we have
so from the outside, these commands, they correspond to the .NET command line tool, right? So everything you can do with that, you will see in that window. Okay, drop down.
So currently, I would just type it in that input box here. Currently, that runner would execute something like .NET Build and then our solution, which is in that input box there. Now I talked about the restore step, right? And that is something, and not only that, but several other options, what we can find if we show advanced options. So, or actually, in this case, I think we found an issue for that to add the no restore checkbox, or am I just blind?
You're in the build command. It was missing, I think, from the build. It was apparent in another command.
Yeah. So that will probably be added. We talked about that already, but in the next we will see it in the next step. So, and then we can define a couple of things we tend to need to apply as a .NET developer, like the frameworks for which it should be built. The output directory is a good one, where the artifacts should be compiled to. We can also define a version suffix, all that stuff. We can run it within a Docker container and change repository, of course, or just whatever is not mentioned here already. We can provide through the command line parameters as an extra step. Now, let's see. The second will probably reveal some more things. Also here, I kind of missed it.
The testing, yes, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So now we're looking at the test command, which works very similarly. One thing that TeamCity adds here is that it even supports using wildcards to execute tests. So that is something that the original command, at least to my last knowledge, doesn't support. But we can select multiple test projects from here, and they would be executed. And here's one of the checkboxes that I was talking about. So the .NET test command actually has an option to not build the projects, which makes sense, especially in this case, since
we already built the project.
Since we already compiled, right? And usually test case filter is something that we might want to use. So, for instance, if you, want to execute fast tests first, unit tests, and only in the second step you want to run integration tests, just to keep the feedback time a little bit shorter, or the iteration time. And now I think it's a good time. Should have done this before.
to run a build.
To run that build, yeah.
Let's see how long it takes for the Cloud Agent to spin up. Otherwise, you'll have to walk us through all the other .NET features as well.
I can anyway. I have one more good example which we can look at. Let's see build steps again. So normally, this is something. It's a good start for a small project, right? You have you compile your solution and then test everything. But at a certain point, and I'm a library author, so for me, what's most interesting is the .NET pack command, and also publish. But we will just look at pack for now. And one thing,
just for folks listening, what does pack produce? What comes out of the pack command?
Pack produces the artifacts. So, like I said before, NuGet packages is the way how you get in dependencies, external code for your project. And .NET Pack does a similar thing with your project. It would produce NuGet packages, which you then can push to NuGet.org, for instance, which is the main repository for dependencies. And but there are also others. TeamCity even has an internal NuGet feed, which you can publish to. But I guess that's more an advanced topic, right?
Yeah.
But here, for instance, it's always good to have some versioning also, right, with your packages. So on each new commit, you might want to produce a different version. And that is something where we can, for instance, use the version suffix parameter or option here. And inside here, I could, for instance, use build number and just access to the build number, which is exposed through for every new run of our configuration, and that would be used then for that. In that case, I would probably again use do not build the project because I've done that already. And yeah, just as a reminder, if I saved that, build number if you need a different. That's not a new feature, but I think where was that? I'm not exactly sure. Is it here? Yeah.
Yes.
Build number format. It's basically this one where you can also change.
Yes. But in the end, that's pretty much, I guess, all you think you need for the beginning to get started, right? I mean, just run a build, run some tests, and then we already see what you have here. So let's see what it did, TeamCity.
So it didn't took very long, and this is the output from my first test run. What we can see already, let's go back for a moment, is we can see that it has a, what was that called again? Build status message. Tests path 10.
Say that again, please.
Yeah, I think the status message for the build. So usually it just says succeeded or
yes, the commit status. Yeah,
exactly. And since we added this, what was it again? Since we added this package here, we automatically get this nice output for tests that have been run already. So if one of those fails, then we would see that. But as you may remember, we had no implementation for our tests. So
don't say that. It's beautiful having 10 super slick, fast tests running successfully.
Right. And I think that's it from my side.
Right. I think what I'd like to just as a quick overview again for the folks out there listening. First of all, thank you, Matthias. That was really interesting to see how easy it actually is to get started by building .NET projects. And now with the new version, again, there's just one .NET runner, as I mentioned already, one to rule them all. You can do everything that Matthias just showed you to build your projects, to pack them up, publish them to a NuGet repository, whatever you want, you'll find it in TeamCity. Thanks again, Matthias. And now let's see. Yes, and now let's see if we can go back to our Python runner. Hello, Paul.
Hello, and thanks, Matthias, for filling in. I appreciate that. Firefox and StreamYard were not happy. Chrome appears to be okay. Let's see how it goes.
I have a good feeling.
All right, so what we were going to do is take my sample project, and we were going to try and bring it into CI as a Python project and do some Python things. Is that right?
Absolutely. And what I would like to mention before you start is that obviously in TeamCity 2022, there's a new Python runner, which we're going to use. And there was only an external plugin available for building Python projects up until now. Now it's all nice, built in with super tight features. And Paul hopefully is going to be able to set up a new nice little Python project. So let's give it a try with your Lex League project.
All right. So I'm going to get the URL. Is that right?
Yes.
I'll get the HTTPS. I'll copy it. I'll come over to the TeamCity UI and click the Create Project button. Is that right?
That is a good start if you want to create a new project. Yes,
Cleverly disguised as Create Project. All right, we were going to talk about some of the things on the screen, including some of the sources, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to do a repository URL. I could go ahead and link this to GitHub and get some browsing of repositories and stuff. You talked a little bit about Bitbucket.
Yes. So what Matthias actually, he did it by going to the github.com tab. He was logged into his GitHub account, and then you can browse your repositories. But what you're doing is absolutely fine. You just have a repository URL. You paste it into that field, and you're good to go.
All right. So it's in the process now of contacting the Git repo and giving me some options for some names. I'm just going to accept these, right?
You can just go with the defaults. If your project isn't named Lex League for whatever reason, then you could change it, but just go with the defaults.
All right. And it kind of out of the box knows, hey, this looks like Python. I didn't tell it was Python, right? It figured it out.
Yes, we saw that earlier also. So what TeamCity does is it scans your repository, has a look inside, and sees some Python files. So it says, well, it looks like a Python project. You might want to add a Python build step, similar to the .NET build steps you just saw earlier. But I'd love you not to choose the auto-detected build step. Instead, I'd like you to try adding some manual build steps from scratch, basically.
Okay. And I guess kind of in the process, we're going to recreate what it was going to do for us, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to add a build step. And this one, which one you want to do first? You want to do linting first, or do you want to do testing first?
Let's do testing first. Let's do testing first.
All right. So this is a Python build step. And when I choose that, it's going to give me some Pythonic choices, right?
Yes. And this is our new shiny Python runner, which gives you a ton of nice Python choices. So let's see what those choices are.
All right. So under File, I have a choice for PyTest, which is the testing framework that I have in my project. I know it's the testing framework because I have what Python considers the statement of dependencies. And one of my dependencies is PyTest.
Right.
All right. So what else do I need to do? Do I need to set the working directory?
So the working directory, you don't need to set it. So you just have a basic, a default Python working directory setup, I guess, with all your tests under the tests folder, as far as I could see. So if you wanted to have a separate, so TeamCity is smart enough, or the Python runner is smart enough to run the tests from your tests folder. If you wanted to change that, you could obviously change your working directory, give the PyTest runner some arguments even, but you can go with the defaults. By default, it should just work fine.
And this is cool because my project does expect this to be Python 3 and not going to do Docker.
Not gonna, you could choose to use Docker if you wanted to. So, for example, if you had a Docker image with all your Python utilities installed, you would just put in the image name here, and TeamCity is smart enough to pick it up, run everything inside a Docker container. So, don't try and use Docker this time.
All right, go ahead and save this.
No, don't save this just yet, because we're missing out on something.
Oh, yes.
The Python runner, and you need to tell me a bit about it. The Python runner also has really tight environment tool support, meaning virtualenv and pipenv, but I'm not an expert on pipenv and virtualenv, so you need to say a couple lines. Sure.
The world of Python has different ways to get isolation in different projects, similar, I guess, in JavaScript to like node under modules. And virtualenv is the one that's kind of considered the standard. And what TeamCity is doing is saying, okay, for virtual env, I'm also going to go look for where you state your dependencies. And by default, most Python projects, most Python apps put their dependencies in a file called requirements.txt at the root. And so by selecting virtual env, I'm kind of turning on this ability for TeamCity to install not just my package, but my package's dependencies. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
And then I get some other choices about where I would like TeamCity to put my virtual environment in a folder called .vm in the root.
Yeah, absolutely. But that looks fine. We have the environment tool support requirements TXT. You actually showed your requirements TXT just a minute ago with all these dependencies. If you just hit save now, then the Python runner will do its thing. Do you want to maybe just trigger a build just now so we don't have to wait again? Well, we'll do yes.
We'll go ahead and do run. I don't want to make any options on the run, right? So I'm just going to put it in the queue.
Yes, put it in the queue.
So it's in the queue, and let me ask you a question while it's getting going. What is it doing right now? Is now when it's doing the clone, or did it already do the clone?
So the build agent is starting up basically, and then the clone happens. So on the build agent side, yes.
And if I run another build, is it reusing that clone, or is it getting another clone?
It's reusing that.
All right. And so that helps speed up the time between builds, especially if you got a colossal repo or it's at a Git target that might be slow or something.
Yeah. All right, and while that build agent is booting up and doing its thing, you might want to edit your configuration again.
All right. So we're going to, let's see, go back to my build, and I've got my, sorry, no.
No, to the right, there's like this button, this huge button saying edit configuration.
Oh, yeah,
that should hopefully.
Okay. Okay.
Good. And then you might want to go to on the left to the build steps again.
Yep.
And
we
you said
wanted to add another step, right?
Yes, and you wanted to, at the very beginning, you said, do you want to do linting first and testing first? And now let's do some linting, actually.
Okay. So I'm going to choose Python again, which then gives me access to the cool things that you can do for Python, such as, let's see, I said Flake 8, which was in my requirements, and that's one of the linters for Python. You also had support for PyLint, which is another linter.
And just while we choose that, maybe could you just tell me as a non-Python user about the other commands, just quickly what they are, what they do in that drop-down list?
Sure. Unit test is the test framework test runner that's built into Python. It's in the standard library. So it's kind of old, doesn't have all the features. PyTest is the most modern testing library. It's the one most people have switched to. And then the next two are linters. And then these are important because there's lots of other machinery that goes into a Python CI, Python project, modern Python repos, and those things would let us tap into those, right?
Right. Yeah, you can run files, modules, even a custom script, which gives you a text box, and you can put your Python script right into the TeamCity UI. But for now, let's go with Flake 8. And actually, I think I asked you that, should we just show off that we don't want to just lint everything, but just a specific folder? So remember, you can actually give arguments to that Flake 8 command. Right. You could also use the file browser. There's a tiny icon to the right next to that.
I would have to go over to the other tab and see, oh, that's where I put my source code was here.
Yes, and just let's go with the LaxLeak folder. You could obviously also choose to run to lint everything, but now let's just do this one folder.
Good point. We will go ahead and save, or do I need to do an environment tool?
Yes, you do. You do. Yes.
Which means each one of these build steps is in isolation. Is that right?
Yes.
All right.
So you just, you save. No Docker
right
again.
Now, Flake 8 is after PyTest. What if I want to change the order of that?
You can just hit reorder build steps, right? You're on it, and then and now you could have given the build steps names. Now they are just called Python and Python.
I accepted those. Just to help myself a little bit, I will go ahead and call this step. This is
right.
So now I can tell the difference between those two.
Yes.
All right.
Now, you could even choose to run yet another build because we did run a build just a minute ago, but let's run another build with the linting, right?
Okay.
So let's just see. Yeah, click run. Let's see what happens. If we're lucky. Right? It's adding to the queue, so just the very first time it redirects you back to the overview page. So for now, just go to the project's overview page, and you'll see that is the build queue, right? Even there. And you can even see, right, we were fast enough, we triggered a couple of builds. Right. You'll see the overview of your Python project.
All right.
You'll see that 10 tests were passed. You had 1 inspection in total happening. Let's click that link and see what TeamCity can actually show you.
That's already really useful information.
Yeah. So I mentioned the tests. I mean, I showed the test history overview page, but you can obviously just, when you click at the test tab, you'll see all the tests that were run for that were inside your Python project, first of all, and that were run. They didn't take too long, and they were all successful, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and these are the names in my project, so they're familiar to me.
Right. And if you go back to the overview page again, you'll also see, actually, I'd like to see if you have been a good developer. I'd like to see how that linting turned out, the code inspection. So if you click the code inspection link that is there, let's see. It's right next to your mouse, actually.
All right, here?
Nope.
Sorry, I got to expand this.
Yes, you got to expand this. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, I found a problem.
There was one problem. Yeah.
Something in my code. Let's look at the report. So this is essentially the output of Flake 8.
Yes.
But put into, because you have special support for Flake 8, you can put a special UI on it, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. And I think in LaxLeak, there was only the init.py file, and you had trailing whitespace. How could you have trailing whitespace in your file?
I know, it's so obvious, isn't it?
Yes, it's so obvious. Yeah. But in general, it's actually pretty cool that your Python project, you could just build it with adding a couple of steps, and you see proper test output and the linting output, and the build just worked out of the box.
Right, and it's not just that I got the CI, and it's not just that I got the CI for Python, but the things that were really important to me, you put a nice discoverable UI on it, hook it up into other parts of the machinery, so presumably triggers could happen on these different kinds of things that went right or went wrong. So it's really useful.
Yeah. And that is actually already what our goal was. Yeah. And I'm happy that this actually worked.
Yeah, indeed. And we ran, we wound up running 3 builds, right? Yeah, 3 builds.
Yes.
All ran pretty quickly.
Yes.
It's, if I were to go over to the repo and make a change.
Yes.
Like if I went over and fixed my white space problem, what would happen?
If you fix your whitespace problem, so the way TeamCity works is that by default it uses polling. So every 60 seconds, for example, in TeamCity Cloud, it checks your repository for changes and then automatically triggers a build. And there's also other options like having commit hooks and whatever, but by default, it's just polling every 60 seconds. There will be a new build for the changes you made. Will all happen automatically.
You've made me a better Python.
I'm happy about that. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate your time, and we got it to work. That was super cool.
Thank you for bringing me on. Sorry about the Firefox problem.
No worries. All right. Which brings us to the last segment of this webinar. I'm just going to walk all of you through the changes that we saw, just giving a nice little summary of everything we did so far. And actually, maybe Igor is sharing is going to share my screen again. Right, here's my screen. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of all the features we saw, and I missed out on a couple of them, but you'll find them on the What's New in TeamCity 2020.2 page. If you Google for What's New in TeamCity 2020.2, you'll end up on that page. To remind you again, at the very beginning of this webinar, we started with that you now can log into TeamCity with external services, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket account, whatever. Really helpful, streamlining your authentication methods. Right. At the end, we had a look at Bitbucket Cloud, the pull request support, in combination with the commit status publisher. If you're using Bitbucket Cloud, you'll appreciate that feature. We had Paul come in, talk about building Python projects, as simple as putting in the URL to your Python project and adding a build runner, our new Python build runner, with a couple of build steps, and you're good to go. That's all you need to do. I had a tiny mention about Space, the commit status publisher, that it also works for our very own Space tool. And what I find a super exciting feature is the agentless build steps feature. We had that at the very beginning, where you can detach builds that need agents from builds that need to wait on external services that take an infinite amount of time, and you can do some work with them in between. Really, really helpful for utilization of your build agents. Then there's a couple of features I'd like you to read up about. It's about our multi-server support. It's a bit tricky to show in this webinar. Also some other pro features for pro administrators with the external storage and a cleanup schedule. Please read up on these features if you're an administrator of a TeamCity server. And last but not least, I also mentioned the eye candy, the new Sakura UI, the perfect combination of features and design. We're always adding new stuff to the new UI. And I think there was a question before when the new UI was finished. There is no definitive answer to that when there's no final release date, but we're adding new stuff in every single release and making it better. And we also always appreciate your feedback, even if it comes in as tickets. With the new UI, build dependencies, test history page, the build log search, very important. And I also mentioned a bit about the UI plugin development framework. If you're interested in writing front-end plugins with our plugin framework, then please have a look at the talk Denis, one of our developers, front-end developers, gave at the TeamCity Technology Day, and you'll get started writing your TeamCity plugins in no time. That about sums up all the changes that happened in the TeamCity 2020.2 release. Thanks for listening, and I hope I see you in the next webinar again. Thank you.